is up, everyone? Welcome back to the Long Lens Podcast. This is the podcast where I answer questions from my filmmaking community, and I just talk about YouTube and filmmaking. Sometimes we have guests on this show, but the majority of the time, it is a Q&A podcast. So I'm answering questions from my viewers and listeners and just trying to answer them to the best of my abilities. I don't have all the answers. I don't know everything, but hopefully I can shed a little bit of insight on some of the questions that you all have. So the way that the podcast works is one of the perks of supporting me on Patreon is you always get your questions read first and you get a little shout out on this podcast. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go to our Patreon questions first, and then I'll go to the YouTube community. So we have a pretty good amount of questions this month. 3 of them are going to be here on Patreon. So the first question is from Will M. And Will asks, what do you think about Apple's shot on iPhone campaigns? They recently released Final Cut Camera, which joined some other pro video apps for iPhone like Kino. I haven't tried either, but the manual mode camera apps like Halide and Moment are super useful when you just have your phone. Again, I'm not huge on mobile filmmaking. Now, the iPhone 15 was one of the only iPhones that I actually would say, yeah, that would be a substantial upgrade, because even with the 10-bit stuff that you get on like the 13 and the 14 Pro, like those still seem like a little incremental upgrades, and I've seen some really great stuff out of those two phones. But again, with the tone mapping and the like hyper sharpening of iPhone footage, it just never looked right until the iPhone 15 with not only the Apple ProRes but also the Apple Log, which is a proper log profile. So that's the only camera that I would actually say, yeah, switching to that one would be very, very substantial difference for video. But again, I've actually been considering getting a new phone. I use the iPhone SE2, which is essentially just an iPhone 11, but smaller and cheaper. And I like how this phone functions. I would almost upgrade to the iPhone SE3 just because it's a little bit faster, but it's the exact same form factor. I like the form factor of this phone. I'll probably upgrade to something like, I don't know, like a 14 Pro or a 13 Pro, something cheap that I can get in the refurbished market. And the reason that I won't go to the 15 is not only because of the price, but it's just because I would be going to it for the video functionalities. And I just don't like using my phone as a video camera. In a pinch, it can work. I've used iPhone footage in my videos in the past, but I think of my iPhone as a daily task tool and not a professional video tool. So even though you can use these iPhones as professional video tools, I don't like if my S5 IIX started receiving texts and notifications all the time while I was filming, that would drive me insane. And that's essentially the experience that you get when you're shooting on your iPhone. Yeah, you can, go into airplane mode and turn those off. But again, I don't know, something about the form factor and just how iPhones are. For what I like to do, I just don't like using them as professional tools. I like to use them as daily task tools. My maps, my calendar, my text, my internet browsing, Instagram, can all do it on this phone, and it's great, but I just don't like making my professional work with an iPhone. I know people that do it and it looks great. It's just not for me. I do think that the shot on iPhone campaigns are really cool. Like the keynote for the iPhone 15 was amazing, that it was shot all on the iPhone 15 Pro Max, shot in ProRes Apple Log. I mean, it just it looks really, really good. And I watch Gox. I think he has like 3 different channels, Gox Art, Gox, and then Gox 2. One of those channels, he posts a lot of like his iPhone films that are shot on the iPhone 15 Pro Max, I believe. And they look amazing. So like you can get really, really good looking stuff out of the iPhone 15. Again, it's just not for me. I would rather run around with a GH5 and do stuff than with my iPhone. All right, the next question from Will M is also, could you recommend a rig or something to mount the mic? It has its own shock mount onto a phone. I got a regular tripod mount and tried using a double-headed tripod screw to mount my USB mic to it, but that introduces some issues like needing to use a spacer and then get the alignment right after screwing it in. So I'm not sure which phone you use, Will. The only times that I've used mics on my phone were back when I was trying to enter stuff into the Moment Film Festival. And I forget what the rig is called. I'll try to leave it in the description. I just used like an iPhone clamp rig that had a cold shoe on the top. And that's really the only experience I have shooting with iPhone and, mics and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm not sure how much you're rigging your phone out, but I think just a simple clamp rig with a cold shoe on the top, and then like a tripod mount on the bottom is what I would go for. So I would say try to keep your rig minimal if you can, unless you absolutely need the peripherals that you're adding to it. Just, go without them. A simple clamp mount with a cold shoe on the top, tripod mount on the bottom will probably get you where you need to go. So this next question is from Jose Montero. He says, Hola Nigel, how do you manage your video goodies, plugins, music files, graphics, etc.? I have dedicated NVMe drive for editing material, but I would like to know your take on this. Abraço de Lisboa. Yeah, so for certain video assets, I'll create them specifically for a certain video. So there are some video assets that I'll either create or I'll download and I'll put them in the project folder of that video. But if it's just general video assets, I have a video assets folder that lives on my desktop on my actual laptop hard drive. So they're just always there. I don't got to worry about whether or not I, plugged in the right hard drive or I have the right RAID system set up. It's always on my desktop. So if it's like a title pack, or if it's a sound effects pack, or like my end bumper with like my little, monogram logo plays at the end of all my videos, all of that lives in a video assets folder on my desktop. And that's just what I go to. So whenever I need to put my end bumper, I go to that folder. If I have sound effects that I use on a regular basis, they go in that folder. So maybe if I'm talking about a very specific camera or something like that, and I create a little title animation or something that's for that video, that's going to live in the project folder of that video. But everything else just lives in a folder called video assets on my desktop. Hope that helps, Jose. And those are all the questions from Patreon. Big thanks to all my Patreon supporters. You know who you are. I'll leave them right there too. These fine people support me on Patreon. You can too. If you're listening, this video is also on my second channel, Nigel Bajos 2. So you can check that out. There's a bunch of other perks on Patreon, like you get to see behind the scenes photos and videos. I do tutorials. You can download any of my $5 Luts for free, which if you're supporting me on Patreon, not quite sure how to do that, be sure to message me on Patreon and I can walk you through it. But yeah, thank you so much to my Patreon supporters. Now let's go to the YouTube community page. Also, I'm using a new lens on this S5 IIX. If you think you know which one it is, definitely let me know in the comment section. All right, and we have 23 questions on the YouTube community page, so that's a little more than usual. So I'll try to get through this as quickly as possible. First question is best low budget beginner camera for filmmaking. It depends on what you mean by low budget. That is a very nuanced question. I feel like low budget means different things to different people. To a high-end cinematographer, an S5 IIX is low budget. To a beginner, S5 IIX is way out of their price range. So I'm gonna give you 3 different cameras for 3 different price ranges. If you are under the $500 mark as far as like cameras that you want to get, I would look into like a Panasonic GH5. Sometimes you can find them for under $500. If not, something like the G85 or the G7 could be good options. You can get those for well under $500, and that'll give you a little bit of extra money for lenses, which you also have to, budget in your total budget for your camera kit. So under $500, look for a G7, G85, or a GH5 from Panasonic. Something from Sony, you might be able to get a ZV-E10 or an A6300 for around that price, but those are a little bit harder to find for under $500. Every time I do this podcast, I forget to drink and my voice starts to wear out after a while. And under the $1,000 price range, you might want to look into the original Panasonic S5. It's pretty good. It doesn't have great autofocus, but as far as the image goes, it's probably one of the best images you can get for under $1,000. You could also look into the Fuji X-T3. It's not going to have autofocus, just like the S5 doesn't have very good autofocus, but it's also not going to have image stabilization where the S5 does. Something from Sony, again, you could look into an A6400 or something, but I would honestly say stick to either a Lumix or a Fuji if you want to stay under that $1,000 price tag. And if we bump up to the $1,500 price tag, that's where I would say look for a used S5 II, not the 2X, just the Lumix S5 II. You really can't beat the S5 II for under $1,500, and in the used market, you can definitely find it for that much. So that's what I would go for. You could also look for a used FX30 if you want to go the Sony route, but you're going to have a smaller sensor, worse image stabilization, and it's not going to be weather sealed. At least I don't think so. If the FX30 is weather sealed, let me know in the comment section below, but I'm almost sure that it's not weather sealed. So yeah, under $1,500, I really think that the S5 II is probably the best option that you can go for in that price range. So yeah, those are the cameras that I would recommend in those different budgets. So the next question is from the same person. He was saying, is the M50 good for filmmaking? It can be if you know how to use it. I've talked about this before, but the problem with cheaper cameras like that is that they're usually bought by people that are beginners, and so they don't typically get the best footage that you can get out of those cheap cameras. The idea behind all these cheap cameras is that they're not very good because a bunch of novice filmmakers use them, but you put an M50 in the right hands and it can, look really, really good. So if you're looking into the M50 and you get it and you don't like what you see, I would encourage you that, you just have to start learning how to use it more, and not just learning how to use the camera, but learning how to use lights and composition and setting your camera up the right way, all that kind of stuff, because that goes into making a good image too. It's not just the camera. All right, the next question is, can you do a meetup, a local filmmaker pop-up shop type for us in Dallas cinematographers and videographers? I would love to do that. The only problem is I don't live in Dallas anymore. I live in Portland, Oregon again, which is where I'm from. If there are any Dallas cinematographers and filmmakers that want to do a meetup or something like that, you should start that. I definitely think that having a community within the filmmaking space is good. I do feel that here in Portland as well, and it's a really good feeling. So if there are any filmmakers who want to start that, you definitely should. And the next time I'm in Dallas, I'll try to be there for one of them. This next question actually has 4 replies, and this happens a lot. Like, I'll ask for questions for this podcast, and then a lot of other people will, chime in and give their answers. But the question is, which secondhand camera is a step up from the 600D that will allow me to use my current 3 lenses without paying $500 to $1,000 on a new body? Yeah, and a lot of people, one person said the Canon 80D. Someone says like the GH5, you would need an adapter or a speed booster. I don't know what lenses this person has, but someone suggested the 5D Mark IV, which I know the 5D Mark IV does crop in 4K anyway, so maybe APS-C lenses would work fine on that. But if I was going to go for a camera as an upgrade from the 600D, which I believe is the T3i, I would probably go for like a 90D because it's the same size sensor. So you're not going to be having to deal with, different crop factors. And it's a very similar menu. The whole camera system is similar. But if you wanted a much better image, you could get something like a G85 and a cheap Vilchok speed booster, and you can put your Canon lenses on there and use it with that camera. You'd be gaining resolution and image stabilization and just overall video quality, and you wouldn't really be losing anything because the T3i doesn't have great autofocus and it doesn't have great dynamic range, and it's kind of a beginner, camera as far as video goes. So I would say, like, just because I'm a fan of Lumix and like the quality that they pack into their cameras, I would say something like a G85 with a speed booster would almost be better than a 90D. But you could go for any of those suggestions from the other people, like an 80D or a 5D Mark IV. I would just suggest, if you're into video, go for something like a G85 with a speed booster. This next question is, do you still use Magic Lantern? No, I don't, because I don't have the EOS M anymore. Even though that camera was really fun to use, it was pretty clunky, and for my workflow, it just slowed me down a little bit too much. So if you're making short films and stuff like that and you're working a long time to, release something, that's totally fine. But I usually have like, a week or 2 weeks of turnaround time for a lot of my paid contract work and my YouTube videos. So I just need something that was a little easier to work with. So that's why I got rid of the EOS M. All right, the next question is dream guest on your podcast. I mean, dream guest would be someone like Jason Hernandez or Dan Wolf or maybe even Ty Evans, just so I could talk about nostalgic skate filming stuff, which if you don't know who they are, they're pretty much like legends in the skate filmer industry. But on a more like realistic approach, someone like Lewis Potts, he'd be really fun to talk to just because he's also a skateboarder and he's a really good cinematographer. Or like, I guess, Danny Gewurz or, some of the other like, big names in the filmmaking YouTube space. They'd be cool to talk to too. But honestly, if we're talking dream guests, it would be someone like Jason Hernandez or Ty Evans, Dan Wolf, someone like that. All right, next question is, could you discuss why someone would use APS-C anamorphic lenses on a full frame camera instead of using the equivalent full frame lens and then cropping? I understand why someone would use a full frame anamorphic lens on a full frame camera, but can't wrap my head around why they would use a crop factor anamorphic lens. I am clearly missing something. Thank you. Yeah, okay. So the world of anamorphic is still kind of new to me, and That question, I feel like, probably has a perfect answer that maybe I'm not qualified to even speak on. One thing I will say is that there are the different like stretch factors of different lenses. So the stretch factor could be a reasoning behind why someone would pick an APS-C anamorphic as opposed to a full frame anamorphic. If they want like a wider stretch or not so wide of a stretch. I think it could depend on which camera you're shooting on too, whether you can shoot an anamorphic mode. I know that on like the Creator, they shot on anamorphic lenses, but since the FX3 doesn't shoot open gate, it only shoots 16:9. They shot with a really, really wide stretch and then cropped in. So I don't know, maybe if they had the opportunity to shoot on to shoot open gate, maybe they would use different lenses. Who knows? I've only ever shot on anamorphic lenses that were designed for the sensor size that I had. So I've only ever used micro four thirds anamorphic lenses that were designed for micro four thirds. So I can't really speak to that. But if anyone knows the answer of why you would shoot on an APS-C anamorphic lens on a full frame body as opposed to a full frame anamorphic lens, I know that they're not super readily available, so maybe that could be like one of the issues as well. But if you know the correct answer, let us know in the comment section. Okay, next question is, hi Nigel, how do you follow the rat race of camera releases? Some people are saying that with the GH7, Nikon Z6 Mark III, or even the C400, we are going to a plateau with the RD of cameras, a time with less impressive upgrade and more fine adjustment. How have you an opinion on that? I don't really keep up with the rat race of new camera releases. The only cameras that I really have cared about in the last couple of years are the S5 Mark II X or the S5 II, just because I think that these are the best cameras in the price range. I know that some people will disagree with me on that, but I think that if you're talking about under $2,000, I don't think that there's anything better than the S5 II or the S5 IIX. Now, I wouldn't say that these are the best cameras that have been released. There are cameras by like Sony or Nikon that probably are better than these cameras, but in the price range, I don't think that there is really anything better than these cameras. So the S5 II and S5 IIX were the only like real cameras that actually excited me in the recent past until the GH7 came out. That one looks really good. I'm still waiting to see if I'll actually be able to review it. Someone from Panasonic told me that they would, try to get one out to me. That has yet to be seen, but I don't really keep up with like the rat race of cameras. You'll notice on my main channel that I don't really talk about the latest and greatest cameras all the time. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like as a working professional, it probably makes sense to like keep up with the new stuff and, try to like upgrade your gear when it makes sense. But all in all, I do think that like if you were a working professional, you could probably still do amazing stuff with the GH5. I just think that with the new cameras coming out, they just make your life easier in certain ways, whether it be better autofocus, better dynamic range, 32-bit float audio internally or something like that. They just make it so you have to bring less gear to get the job done. And that's kind of how I see new cameras. Is like, is the GH7 going to be better than S5 IIX? Well, it'll be better like rolling shutter performance. It'll have 32-bit float internally if I want that extra XLR adapter. But I can just be more intentional with how I move my S5 IIX. I can buy a 32-bit float recorder. I'll have to bring more stuff, but I can still accomplish the same things that the GH7 would, give me. So that's kind of how I see new cameras these days. Like they solve problems that aren't necessarily like the biggest issue ever, but it's just those minor issues that can really save you a lot of time or save you in a lot of weight so you don't have to bring as much gear. All right, next question is, what's the number one tip that you wish you would have known when you started filmmaking? I feel like the one thing that I wish I would have just grasped more is upstage lighting or backlighting. It's such a simple like technique to just, shoot the shadow side of your subject, but it just took me forever to like figure out why that looked good, and I kept on trying to fight it. I kept on putting lights in front of me or like, putting the camera behind the light, and it just never looked as good. So upstage lighting is just so much better to make things, give them a little bit of an outline, and it just looks a lot more professional. So that's one thing that I wish I would have learned a lot sooner. So this next question is, I would love to know how to use Luts on my old GH3. I love my camera, but I feel like I always have to shoot in natural. I don't actually have any Luts designed specifically for the GH3. I might come out with those in the future maybe, but what I do use for my GH3 is film convert nitrate, and I'll leave a special link in the description. You can get it at a discount. Film convert nitrate's great because it supports the Panasonic GH3. and you can tweak the colors, put different film emulations and profiles on it. So you can even add like halation with a new halation update from Film Convert Nitrate. So I would definitely look into that. Look into Film Convert Nitrate if you have a GH3. That's what I used to grade all of my GH3 stuff in the past. So this next question is testing that DJI Focus Pro on an older Panasonic camera with a speed booster. Yes, I have done that on Patreon. So if you would like to see what the DJI Focus Pro plus a Mikey Cine lens and a Veilchalk speed booster look like on a Panasonic G85, which notoriously has bad autofocus, then you can check that out on my Patreon account. But you'll have to actually subscribe to my Patreon. It's only $5 a month. You can see that video, see how it works. I think that actually works pretty good. There's a lot of other behind the scenes videos you can check out too, but I have done that on Patreon, so you can go there if you want to see it. This next question is, any budget camera gimbal that could be used with a Panasonic G9 and a 12 to 35 millimeter f2 in terms of weight? Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure my old DJI Ronin SC can handle that. I put the original S5 with the 20 to 60 lens on this, and it balanced just fine. So the DJI Ronin SC is only like $150 or something like that nowadays, and I honestly, like, all gimbals kind of do the same thing. So I have never seen the need to upgrade from my Ronin SC. The only reason I would upgrade from it is if I had a bigger camera with bigger lenses that I wanted to fly on it. But when I'm running a gimbal, I try to keep my camera kit as small as possible. So I would look into trying to find a DJI Ronin SC. They're pretty cheap. Okay, next question. Who, if any, YouTube channel do you draw inspiration from? Right now, I draw a lot of inspiration from Theo Crawford. I really like his videos. I could care less about film photography, but I just like watching his videos because that Austrian accent of his is just very soothing, and his videos are just very calm and peaceful. So I like Theo Crawford a lot. All right, the next question is, do you use auto ISO when filming outdoors in uncontrolled environments, or completely manual, including also ISO? Yeah, I always do manual ISO. I don't think I've ever used auto ISO unless I'm going from outdoors to indoors. But even then, I try not to do that type of shot very often, so it's very, very minimal. Yeah, I basically never use auto ISO. I know that there are some applications, it's just I've never found myself in a situation where I would need to use it. This next question is, I love all the Micro Four Thirds content, especially the budget stuff with older Lumix cameras. I found your channel when I was using my G7. I recently purchased a G9 Mark II. Although it's not a true budget option yet, I feel like it got slept on due to the full frame options. Would love some comments on the viability of this platform and other options in comparison versus the FX30 or even an S5 2X. Yeah, so I definitely think that, like, unless you need full frame, you really want that shallow depth of field, the G9 Mark II, great camera. You get the same phase detect autofocus. You get even better image stabilization. I still like Micro Four Thirds, but there is something to be said about the price of full frame right now. Like, as I said, you can find an S5 II for around $1,500 in the used market. So it is kind of a hard sell for the G9 Mark II, unless you want cheaper lenses and smaller lenses. So if you're traveling a bunch, I just did a really quick trip down to Texas and I brought my S5 Mark IIX, and the entire time I just wished that I had like a Sony a6700 or like a Sony FX30 with an 18 to 50 by Sigma, just for the pure fact that my S5 Mark II and my lenses are just so big and heavy, and I had to carry it on my back the entire time. So, and that's something that I hear a lot. It's just like, hey, I'll get the G9 Mark II and then the Lumix 10 to 25 f1.7. The Lumix 10 to 25 f1.7 is not only insanely expensive, but it's also a huge lens. The G9 Mark II is the same size as my S5 IIX as far as like body size goes. And so technically, I think that my S5 IIX with my Sigma 28 to 70 is smaller in size than a G9 Mark II with a 10 to 25. So you're kind of defeating the purpose almost of having a Micro Four Thirds camera if you're going to be using a lens combo like that anyways. Sure, you'll be getting better rolling shutter and better like IBIS, but I still think that it kind of defeats the purpose if you're going to be using big lenses on, a Micro Four Thirds camera. All right, and the last question for this podcast is, I love playing around with older but great gear. Have you heard of situations where older but larger sensors have better low light performance than more modern, denser ones? Well, I mean, I don't know any situation where someone would purposely choose an older full frame camera to get better low light, unless of course you were maybe shooting with a GH5 or let's say you're shooting with a GH7. GH7, with how good it is, probably still isn't as good in low light as like the original A7S or something, right? So theoretically, if you were, shooting on the GH7, you randomly needed a really low light shot and you had a Sony A7S, then yeah, I would see that as a situation where you would use an original A7S if you were shooting in low light. But unless that specific situation happened, I couldn't really see it being commonplace for someone to purposely choose an older full frame camera as opposed to something like an A7S III, which is going to be better in low light than the original A7S and have much better picture quality. So yeah, I don't think that's a very common thing, what you're describing, but I do think that if you're shooting on like a Micro Four Thirds camera that has great image quality, in well-lit areas, but then you needed a really, really low light, camera, an A7S or an A7S II, which are older, but full frame and much more light sensitive cameras, could be a good piece of kit to throw in there if you just needed a super, super low light shot. Anyways, those are all of the questions that I got for this month's podcast. Thank you to everyone who submitted a question. Again, if you'd like to join me on Patreon, I'll have that in the description below. Again, I don't have all the answers, but I do love, sharing my takes on these questions that you have. Thank you so much for watching and listening to this podcast, and I will catch you all next time. Later.